Welcome to part 2 of our word series using the Layout tab, where we are going to look at columns. Did you know that columns can actually save you some space on a page? Doesn't seem likely, does it? But in fact, it can. We'll add in line numbers, and we're going to talk about breaks. Different kinds of breaks, page breaks, column breaks, section breaks, and how you can use those to make your document really shine. Hi, I'm Terry, one of the Consumer Technology Specialists for Mid-Continent Public Library, and let's continue learning about the Layout tab. Our example document today is the same one that we used in part 1, so that we're kind of familiar with how it looks on a page. And the first thing that we're going to do is change how this looks on the page by putting it into columns. So we'll go back to the Layout tab, which again is the 4th tab on our ribbon. And then we'll come down to the 4th button, which is Columns. Click on the drop down, and right now it shows us that we are in one column. Who knew, right? Well, we'll come down to 2. And then let me kind of zoom out a little bit so we can see how that looks on the page. Yes, we definitely have 2 columns, and what Word does is it takes your text, it goes all the way down to the bottom of the first column, and then what is left begins at the top of the second column. Well, let's go to columns since we're here and go to 3 columns and see how that looks. Well, 3 columns starts making the columns look really small, and if you have large words, sometimes then you have a lot of white space as Word tries to fit those words in. But let's go back to columns, and let's look at a left column. Now this is kind of interesting. It takes a small narrow column on the left and then adds in a wider column on the right. So it's almost like it takes the 3-column idea, the first one being narrow, and then it really connects the last 2 on the right. Well, then let's go back to columns and go to right. Now, in this case, I don't really have enough text to show how that works, but let me change the margins on this page, and maybe we can figure that out. Let's go to margins and see if wide margins will help us here. Yeah, when I do that, you can see that then the wider parts of text are going to be on the left, and the narrower one column will be on the right. So just the opposite, whatever that name is, that's where the narrow column is. Now let's come also down to more columns, where as we look at this dialog box, we can see that we have selected right, and we also have left, 3, 2, let's go back to 2. And we can look at the preview here on the right-hand side. We could say we want to add a line in between. Oh, that's fun. Let's click OK. And it added a line between. That can be very effective. Let's go back to columns and down to more columns. Because we have some choices here that we don't have other places. For example, if I decide to have more than 3 columns, I can simply type the number in right here in the upper left where it says number of columns, or I could use the up and down arrows to change that information. Now notice also that as I went from 2 to 3, it changed the width and spacing pieces down below. So right now it is trying to keep all 3 columns the same width at 1.17 inches, and the spacing between those columns is a ½ inch. So let's go to take off the line between, and then we could change this spacing, and lots of times you may find that that ½ inch is just too wide. So we could, for example, make it, as I click just to the right of the period, 0.25 and click OK. And let me, in fact, change those margins back to just normal, an inch, and that might help us see just a little bit how that would work. Now, the thing about using columns is when we have columns, see how jagged those right edges are? It just makes the reading kind of hard. So generally, you're going to go back to Home, and as you look at the paragraph group, go to Justify the text so that you have straighter margins. And that just makes it much easier to read, doesn't it? Well, let's go back to Layout. And again, we're looking at columns, and we're looking at more columns. And so as we look at this, we can see that in the lower left, the reason we had equal column widths, which now that I've changed the margins are 2 inches, we can, first of all, take off equal column width. So let me uncheck that. And so instead of saying 2, 2, and 2, I could say that this is 2, and this one is 4, and I'm not sure I'm going to have room for actually enough text for a third one. And maybe even let's make that spacing a 1/2 inch. So I'll just use the arrows to go up to a 1/2 inch. And let me make that a 1/2 inch as well. And I may be running out of width on the page, but notice that Word is smarter than I am, and it's keeping track of the different widths and how that can all fit within the margins on the page. And as I look over at the right, it's trying to do 3. Let's go 2. And that helps a lot. So now I have, again, the 3-inch width, spacing a 1/2 inch, take off the equal, and let's make this, say, 2.5. And as I do that, notice that the spacing adjusted to 1. So Word will work with you as you adjust the column widths to how you want them on the page. And it's really just a wonderful tool. Now, in the very lower left, though, it says apply to the whole document, or again, we have this choice of do we want to apply it to just this point forward. So this dialog box gives us some options that we don't have by just using the buttons. And let's go back to equal column width. And I kind of like that 1/2 inch spacing much better than the inch spacing. And now we'll click OK. And we have 2 columns, but we have something interesting right here with the title that we will need to adjust, because generally we don't want the title as part of our columns, and we'll fix that in just a bit. One of the things I notice as I look at this page is that there's a whole lot of text on the left, not so much on the right. How could I fix that? Because if I just come over here to the bottom left, if I press enter, yes, it would fix it, but then I have a whole lot of places where I have pressed enter, and that can really mess with your document later on, and the larger the document, the more that could be a problem. So let me backspace out so that I'm back to where I was. And instead, let's go to the Breaks button. Now, on my ribbon, with the resolution of my computer, I just see a little button instead of one of the big ones that we've been looking at. But when I click on the drop down for Breaks, I can see that I can create a page break, which I only have one page right now, so that's not going to help me. But look at this second choice. I could create a column break so that wherever I place it moves the text that is below to the next column. So first of all, I need to click where I want that column break to be, and I think I want it right in front of that lower section on my page. Then let's go to Breaks, let's go to Column, and click. And just that easily, I have moved the text that was in the lower left up to a new column. Now let me go to Home, and I'm going to go to the paragraph group in this Home tab, and the top right button here is Show Hide, because this becomes really important, and I'm going to turn it on. Because when I turn it on, it now shows that I have a column break that I added, and that is how the text wound up in this right-hand column. Well, let's go back to the Layout tab and to Breaks, because we might decide to do some other things. Besides the column break, I might decide that I want to add in some section breaks. Well, the section break is how I am going to separate the title from the text. So as I look at the title, it really should be its own section and one column. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click after the title, and I'm going to go to Layout, and then I'm going to go to Break, and then I'm going to go to Section Breaks, but I'm going to say that I want a continuous section break, which means I'm going to put in the section break, and then that section break will stay on the same page. So all of the text will stay on the same page. So let's click Continuous. Now, this kind of dotted line shows me that I have a section break. So now I can click in that first section, go to Columns, and say my title is one section, one column, and you can even see where it says Continuous here. But I have two columns in the next section, and within that second section, I have a column break. Tell you what, let me take this column break out for a little bit. Let's just come right here, and let's not go back, but let's in fact say that instead of sending this to a second column, I want to send this piece of text to a second page. So what I can do is go to Breaks and say I want to send this to the next page. And so now I have the first piece of information on my first page, and I have this second piece of information on the second page. And notice that again, when I look at it with the Show Hide on, I can see that I have dotted lines that show me where that break is. And it's even kind of flipped to a larger size just so that we can see that even better. Let's go back to our document the way it was before we added a column break, or before we added a page break or a next page section break. And let's talk about what happens when you don't use them and you only use Enter. Because that is what a lot of people do. They say, okay, wow, I need this on another page, and so they'll just press Enter forever until they start moving it down to another page. But what happens, or I haven't even gotten to a second page yet, but what happens then if they actually need to type more text where they had those enters? Well, what happens is they start moving things sort of erratically in the document itself, and all of a sudden they've lost control over where things should appear. And so, like with this, I need to now delete, 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 delete to move this up, and it just creates a whole lot of problems that don't necessarily have to be there. So, if I remove all of these enters And even that takes some time, doesn't it? We instead can put back in our page breaks. So let's go to breaks, and we'll just go to a next page break. Now, if I need to add more text, I'm just going to press enter and start typing. And notice how, when I'm still typing, but notice how my next page hasn't moved. I, in fact, have room for a second column on this first page, and it all works out just fine because I've added a break instead of using enter. Now let's also talk just a little bit about the title and how we made it, first of all, one column, but we also added in a break there, and we added in the continuous break, and then we made one column. And sometimes what happens is that then if I add in, say, this column break again, sometimes what happens is these the first line of each column doesn't exactly line up. Now, in this case, it miraculously did, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's offset, and sometimes it's not even offset exactly right. What you can do if you have a problem lining up the first line is that you can come to the first line of the first column, go to Home, go to your Format Painter, and then Format Paint either that space that is there or format the actual text that is there so that this text on the right matches the text on the left, and it should take care of any issues that you might have when you have columns that don't quite line up. While we're talking about lining up, let's also then talk about adding in, as we go to layout, let's talk about adding in line numbers. And line numbers are occasionally used for formal papers. Some schools require them for different kinds of papers that you might need to put in. And again, you can say that I would like to have line numbers that are just continuous throughout the document. I can have them restart at each page, or I can have them restart at each section. So let's look at some of this. First of all, let's go to continuous, and you can see that we're here at 1 and it goes to 24. And then actually the column break winds up being, I believe, 25, because then over on the right we have 26 and 27. As I come to line numbers, I can say, well, I can restart at each page, which might be what I want to do. I can say continuous, which in fact keeps adding the numbers in. I can then also go to line numbers, and I can say, well, restart at each section. And we do maybe have some sections, so let's look at that. We have 1 through 24. We again have not a new section, but we have a column break on page 1. But when we come down to page 2, where we added in a section break, it restarts the numbering as well. Then we could say, well, I want to suppress it for the current paragraph. So let's go back up, and we have a paragraph here starting with right now. So let's go to line numbers and suppress for current paragraph. And look at that. We've now taken off numbers for that paragraph, but we didn't take them off for the lines on the right. Now notice that the numbers did not change on the right. They are still 26 and 27. They are not 15, for example. And then for line numbers, you also have that ability to go to line numbering options and click. And as you look at that page setup dialog box, Down at the bottom, we also have some line number information that we can click on by clicking on line numbers. And it says, okay, do you want to add line numbers? Where do you want to start? So we could go to a page and say, well, we need to start at 250, and that would be fine. And then do we want to count by ones, or do we want to count every other line, for example? Do you want to restart each page, each section, or do you want it to be continuous? So there are a lot of options just by coming to the page setup dialog box and coming down to the bottom right of the layout tab and clicking line numbers, where we can add even more possibilities here. And we're going to click cancel as we get out of breaks and line numbers. To learn even more, be sure to visit mymcpl.org/online learning. There you will find such great resources as Universal Class, LinkedIn Learning, and Learning Express Library. Be sure to join us each week as we premiere new videos every Wednesday and Friday at 1 o'clock. You can find us on Facebook at MCPL 360 or on YouTube at our MCPL MO channel, where you can find our MCPL Consumer Technology Resources playlist.